With that, let's get started. China's foreign and security policymaking apparatus is often described as a metaphorical black box about which analysts know little. This is true to an extent, but at the same time, it's possible to develop a better understanding of the people, institutions, processes, and pressures that go into making China's policy toward the world during Xi's new era, that is, his time as the country's top leader. This report pursues that objective by identifying 5 major trends, mostly internal to the PRC party-state system, that shape its foreign and security policy decision-making. The paper then describes the effects that each trend generates, from bureaucratic incentives to behavioral patterns. I'll go through each trend briefly. The paper goes into great detail laying out the evidence underpinning each trend, so I'll just focus my presentation on the effects that each trend creates. So the first trend is personalization of the system around Xi Jinping. The paper argues that this reduces the influence of various interest groups and therefore the need to bargain with and among them. It raises the prospect of groupthink amongst the loyalists Xi has surrounded himself with, and also potentially increases the importance of achieving certain goals for China under Xi's watch. In addition, this trend creates Xi's centrality, creates a major management bottleneck that could hamper the system during even brief absences. The second major trend is empowering the Chinese Communist Party over the Chinese state. This trend has made more officials into policy implementers rather than policy makers, even on issues below the level of strategy. It's also increased central demands for ideological study, such as Xi Jinping thought study sessions. At the same time, while China's leadership wants to improve coordination and might be making some progress through organizations like the Central Foreign Affairs Commission, it stops short of actions that could allow government organs to really coordinate horizontally, if doing so might plausibly jeopardize the center's control and Xi Jinping's control. The third trend is domestic policy headwinds, including economic slowdown and the search for alternative forms of political legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. This creates 2 contradictory pressures. On the one hand, China reaching out and trying to improve ties with the world to attract and retain capital and technology. And on the other hand, China's turn to an assertive and at times even aggressive form of nationalism to counteract stalling economic growth. These headwinds also dent the power and influence that China gained through its rapid rise and its role as a massive market driving global economic growth. The fourth major trend is elevation of regime security over other concerns, particularly economic development. The report argues that this trend negatively affects Beijing's ties with foreign countries by worsening the experience of foreigners visiting and living in China, by creating an export of China's repressive political ideas, techniques, and technologies to the world, and by complicating how China's foreign and security bureaucracy interacts with its counterparts, in part because they don't know who to invest in building relationships with amidst a changing leadership structure below Xi Jinping. The fifth and final trend is diplomatic and military assertiveness and seeking an active global leadership role. The report argues that this feeds a self-reinforcing cycle of growing tensions, that it requires PRC diplomats to shoehorn any activities into Xi Jinping's marquee frameworks, from the Belt and Road Initiative to the global security initiatives, and also leads China to build out structures of an alternative international order. This includes a growing list of strategic partnerships, most prominently with Russia, China-led or dominated international organizations such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and also China's more active approach to mediation in conflicts around the world, despite its mixed track record. So that's the trends. Examining these trends can help illuminate those macro pressures shaping China's foreign and security policy decision-making. Still, admittedly, many aspects of how the party state makes decisions remain opaque. In the paper, I call these known unknowns, to borrow a phrase from former U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and I argued that it's helpful to be explicit about what these areas are. Where are our knowledge gaps? These include information flows to senior leaders and what in the U.S. context would be called the paper process. It includes the dynamic among Xi and his top advisors and exactly how that works. And it also includes the structure and frequency of important meetings and who participates in those, how they're staffed, etc. And then I also argue that more information about those areas might shed light on larger knowledge gaps related to whether there are informal constraints on Xi Jinping's power, and if so, by what mechanisms they operate, and also how Xi Jinping is thinking about the eventual transfer of power, however far out into the future. Finally, the report argues that to better understand and respond to the intricacies of China's foreign and security policy decision-making, the United States and like-minded partners should take action across 7 areas. The first is to recognize that Xi's personal style and preferences are now the dominant factor shaping China's foreign and security policies, but how that reality manifests will continue to evolve. So we're about 11.5 years into Xi Jinping's reign as China's top leader, and the situation has changed as Xi Jinping is reaching new heights of power, as his signature policies have had time to take effect for good. Sometimes they work and sometimes not. And as China's overall power trajectory is beginning to level off, if not decline. So the China of Xi's third term will be different than earlier periods. So that's number one. Number two, policymakers should track how trends shaping China's decision-making might affect the country's various bureaucratic institutions differently. So for example, we're seeing sort of an empowerment of the Ministry of State Security, China's foreign intelligence organization, while we're seeing a People's Liberation Army that on the one hand is getting more resources and relevance, but on the other hand, it's also getting much more scrutiny from the top leadership. Recommendation number 3, that leaders should anticipate uncoordinated Chinese actions, such as the 2023 spy balloon incident, as well as policies characterized by drift, followed by rapid shifts. And they should do so because they reflect structural features of the system. At the end of the day, coordination still has important limits. And so you see some lack of coordination. And in addition, you see that the incentives at the implementer level are often either to over-implement top-level guidance or to sort of do nothing to avoid getting blamed. And so hence you see shifts like we saw with the end of the zero COVID policy. Recommendation 4, call for policymakers to prepare for deepening policy contradictions alongside continued assertive nationalism from Beijing. Here we see that Xi Jinping ostensibly provides what he calls top-level design for Chinese foreign policy, which should mean more coherent policy formulation. But in practice, that's often meant that the Chinese state and the party state often isn't hashing out policy trade-offs in a robust interagency process, and are therefore ending up with sometimes contradictory policies that are driven by more by slogans than by a detailed reckoning with the on-the-ground implementation realities. Recommendation number 5 is for U.S. policymakers to prioritize direct diplomatic interactions with Xi Jinping. And there's a couple of rationales here, but the main one is that there's no other way to be sure we can inject information, including key signaling, but also clearing up misperceptions into Xi Jinping's information bubble. And as he has more power in the system, but surrounds himself more with loyalists, we're likely to see that information bubble become more constricting. 6, I argue that U.S. policymakers should formally compare assessments of the PRC system with allies and partners. So here we recognize that China's foreign and security policy is going to function in one way towards the United States as a major power rival and competitor, and is probably another way towards every state in the international system. So everyone sort of has a piece of this puzzle, and we should do more to put them together to understand how the machine works overall. 7th, and finally, we call for developing contingency plans for different leadership succession scenarios. Here, call on the old aphorism from Dwight Eisenhower that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. And the idea is really to think through challenges that would come with Xi Jinping's leadership succession, however it happens, to think through those challenges in advance so we're not grappling with them for the first time as events unfold. So with that, that's the report in a nutshell. Readers will find much more detail in the complete version, which is available to download for free on CNAS.org. Now we'll move to the panel portion of the event. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to remind everyone to put your questions in the chat on CNAS.org/live or use the hashtag CNAS 2024 to submit them, and we'll look forward to taking those questions later in the discussion. We're lucky to have with us a top-flight group of experts to discuss these issues today. I'll introduce each of them briefly, and then we'll jump into a discussion. First, we have Rory Daniels. Rory is the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, where she leads and oversees strategy and operation for ASPI's projects on security, climate change, and trade throughout Asia. She's also a senior fellow with ASPI's Center for China Analysis. She was previously with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, where she managed the organization's Track 2 and research portfolio on Asian security issues, with a particular focus on cross-Taiwan Strait relations, US-China relations, and the North Korean nuclear program. Her most recent research project audited the US-China strategic and economic dialogue to evaluate its process and outcomes. So welcome, Rory. Next, we have Amanda Shao. Amanda is a senior analyst for China at the International Crisis Group. She focuses on conflicts in which China plays an important role and developments in China's foreign policy that relate to conflict prevention and resolution. Prior to the Crisis Group, Amanda established and managed the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue's China program in Beijing, overseeing projects related to the South China Sea, US-China relations, and China's evolving approach to conflict mediation. Before that, Amanda was a field researcher on the conflicts in Sudan and South Sudan for the Enough Project. Welcome, Amanda. And last but not least, we have Jude Blanchette, who holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, he was engagement director at the Conference Board's China Center for Economics and Business in Beijing, where he researched China's political environment with a focus on the workings of the Chinese Communist Party and its impact on foreign companies and investors. Prior to working at the Conference Board, Jude was the assistant director of the 21st Century China Center at the University of California, San Diego. And his book is China's New Red Guards, The Return of Radicalism and the Rebirth of Mao Zedong, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Welcome, Jude. So I want to start off this panel with a fairly broad question. So as you talked about a little bit in discussing the report, we've seen China's foreign and security policy evolve over the 11.5 years under Xi Jinping. Broadly speaking, what do you all see as areas of continuity? And where do you see as important continuity? And where do you see as areas of important change? Rory, perhaps I can go to you first.
Okay, thank you, Jake. And thanks so much for having me on this panel. I really enjoyed reading the report. I think if you haven't read it yet, you really should give yourself some time to sit down and digest it. I think it's a really interesting and useful summary of analysis that gives us a starting place to talk about, have a very nuanced conversation about what's going on in China and how to approach it. So in terms of continuity and change in the Xi area, I really think the areas of change that I see most dramatic are access and influence in the policymaking decision chain. As decision-making tightens around Xi Jinping and a few of the people who are closest to his inner circle, access and influence has waned and changed for other actors in the Chinese system. And this difference of access and influence makes it harder to kind of assess how to approach China in the Xi era, because it is constantly changing and it's pretty opaque. And it's created a bit of a feedback loop with Xi Jinping and the parties, the top party leadership's expectation for how China should use its power in the world and how that power should be perceived. I think that there's a sense among those top leaders that a bigger, stronger China should be able to exert its power in the Indo-Pacific and the developing world. And there's also a sense that keeping China strong requires big systemic changes. So the biggest area of continuity I see is that those systemic changes are very, very difficult to enact and make sticky. whether it's moving up the economic value chain, so encouraging people to, have more household consumption and less savings to move into the capital market, to diversify industry, to grow the private sector. That's been a huge area of continuity for China that its leadership would like to change. Reform of the international system as well, the ability for China to exert influence in the international system and to shape standards favorable to its interests is another area where China's leadership really wants to see more systemic change. And then finally, I think rooting out corruption is a big part of this. And, the corruption campaign, which I think is a major area of change in the Xi Jinping era, has to some extent been enacted in order to manage real problems with corruption in Chinese society and in the Chinese domestic political economy. But it's also been used at times to shape that political environment, to shape that access and influence environment. So what has mostly changed is the style of leadership. The kind of underlying problems and priorities, I think, are pretty continuous. And the problem is that it's really not working for Xi Jinping. He's not been able to, at least in the short term, use this change in style to affect those bigger, larger systematic changes. And there's pushback everywhere. I mean, there's pushback among U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific to some of China's expanding national territorial interests, maritime territorial interest. There's pushback inside the system as officials want to kind of continue doing things the way they've always been done, as local governments continue to hold debt, and a lot of bad debt, as the property sector continues to be a place for household savings. And even as young people decide to opt out of the system in their own ways by lying flat or not having babies, even though the Chinese government has encouraged full employment and a more robust, population demographic system. So the net effect of all of this is a China that's got an extremely tight political environment, a sense of dissatisfaction at the top, and therefore a bit of path dependence towards tightening control of the system in order to make these big systemic changes. And the long-term question and challenge is, will it work? Will over the long term, will this change in leadership style endure in ways that actually help China reach its systemic changes and goals?
Thank you, Roy. There's so much there. There's a really comprehensive answer. Amanda, I wonder if I could turn to you for your take on this question of continuity versus change.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jake. And just to echo what Rory said, your report really addresses, I think, some of the most important questions that this community should be asking. And, I think part of the beauty of this sort of research is it unearths a lot of the other questions that we just simply don't have answers to right now. So congratulations on that. I approach this question slightly differently. I agree a lot with what Rory said, but in terms of continuity, I think we've seen more continuity than change in Xi Jinping's approach, at least at the strategic level. When we look at a number of key elements in terms of, China's strategic objectives or their assessment of the external environment, there's a lot of continuity there. So whether that is this consistent linkage between China's pursuit of national rejuvenation and the way it links with a more amenable external environment, right? That is a constant trend. This assessment of the long-term trajectory of the world, this view that the world is essentially in a period of transition, right? Moving from a unipolarity with the US at the top towards multipolarity, what the CCP likes to call the basic trend, which is in large part, driven by China's accruing power and declining US power. And this idea that how China plays its cards during this transitional period will really determine, right, how quickly it reaches rejuvenation, or even whether it can reach rejuvenation. I mean, that's a through line, I think, in these sort of 11 years, right? And another one would be just a very hostile and skeptical assessment of US and Western intentions, which leads to this idea that China is in a long-term struggle with the West, which then leads to this, I would say, a particular hallmark of Xi's foreign policy, which you lay out in the report, which is the idea that China has to be more proactive in the defense of its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. And the idea really that regardless of how cooperative China seeks to be with its neighbors and with its major powers, that this cannot come at the expense of the defense of its core interests. All right. And so we've seen here increasing uses of coercion and force under Xi Jinping. I think where we see the most change, I would call those maybe tactical shifts rather than shifts in overall strategy or ideology. Of course, there's been a bit of a shift in the assessment of the international environment, right? China used to assess that it was simply in an era of strategic opportunity. Now assessments include both this idea that it's one of opportunities and risks, right? I'd say that another change is that we've seen policy options widen for China, whether it is on the persuasion side or on the coercion side, right? So, and that's largely because Chinese economic and military power have grown. And so we've seen many more tools at play, whether it's Chinese Coast Guard around Second Thomas Shoal, the use of economic ties, or being more creative about developing ties at subnational levels, right? So we've seen a broadening, I think, of policy tools and options. And I think maybe just a final note, I think China's initiatives have become more explicitly global. At the beginning of Xi's era, China was, I think, always alluding to the idea that it sought a fairer or more equitable world. But obviously over time, we've seen the emergence of more explicit global initiatives.
Yeah, thank you. That's really useful set of views. Jude, I wonder if I could go to you for your take.
I'm not really sure I have much to add to this after those two great set of remarks. And the beauty of going last is I can say I associate myself with those remarks without having needed to think of them. So no, I think that's all correct. Maybe just to add a few other points. I think the first, to me, striking difference from late 2012 when Xi Jinping took power to today is just how dramatic the transformation towards more unbridled dictatorship the system has become. And I don't use dictatorship in a mustache twisting way, but just diagnostically and analytically to describe the structure of the political system. I'd welcome a better word than dictatorship, but we're clear, Jake, as you write about in the report, whether it's dismantling de jure and de facto limitations on the top leader's power through term limits on the office of the presidency in 2018, new accountability systems within the CMC and the Politburo, which tie individuals more clearly to the personage of Xi Jinping, elevation of his personal authority and ideology within the system. As both Amanda and Rory have mentioned, China has always been autocratic, but a much tighter political system now, constricting civil society such as it was, rewiring the incentive structure for cadres up and down the system, sort of more tightly binding it to Leninist discipline, anti-corruption campaign, which is still rolling and evolving and will always be there because it's both, I think, functionally useful for Xi Jinping, but I think he also sees it as necessary because the system still does have, by their own political logic, far too much autonomy for actors in the system. So, I mean, all this is heading in a very, very dark direction. And before, the way you would get transitions in the system is through changes in leadership. And, we had this in 1976 with the death of Mao, and then poor Hua Guofeng as an interregnum, and then Deng Xiaoping. We had this again starting in the early 1990s, just after 1989, but throughout the 1990s as Jiang Zemin consolidated power and sort of took it in in the model of seeing a sort of softer authoritarianism as trying to enter the WTO, and then again under Hu Jintao. And the problem now is especially by US presidential standards. Xi Jinping is a sprightly 71, or he will be in June. And so I think we have to expect that he's going to remain in office as long as he can, which the actuarial tables would put that certainly for another decade or so. And so just the profound change in political direction that has occurred over the last 11 and a half years, I see no endogenous force which is going to provoke a shift in trajectory that's going to sort of bring the system back from where it's heading now, which is toward, again, this more sort of unbridled dictatorship. And I think that's, you talk a lot about this in the report, Jake. And so I think the real imaginative leap that I can't quite make yet is, what does this system look like in another 8 or 10 years? And a final thought on this is, I think the worsening geopolitical environment around China, much of which is provoked by China's own behavior and concerns that are growing in the region, but nonetheless, China's perception of a increasingly fractious geopolitical environment, which is showing up, as Amanda mentioned, in their highest level assessments, like the 20th Party Congress work report. The worse the geopolitical environment becomes, the more I think it reinforces for Xi Jinping and the system that the course they're on now is correct. Right? You're going to need to double down on fortifying your economy in the face of what you see as a U.S. economic containment strategy. You're going to continue to need to bolster the capabilities of your armed forces to be able to deal with this much more intense military competition in your immediate backyard. And then, it's something we haven't talked a lot about, but the dramatic buildup of a domestic national security administrative state under Xi Jinping starting in 2013, early 2014, I think it just sort of reinforces the necessity of continuing to build this fearsome national security state because of all the challenges you're dealing with, one of which is sort of a slowing economy, which creates all sorts of ripple effects in terms of perceptions of social stability. So that, I think, will probably be the big continuity moving forward, is whereas you'd like to think that failure would provoke a rethink of political trajectory, I just think that's not likely. And so it's just going to be essentially a doubling down of where we're heading now.
Yeah, thank you, Jude. I agree with that. And I think it raises a subsequent question, which is, since the 20th Party Congress back in October of 22, Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with what I use the term loyalists in the paper just to try to kind of use the plain English term. We can debate whether they're loyalists or not, but I think it kind of raises the question that you're saying about what type of advice Xi Jinping might be getting from his inner circle about the nature of the international environment, the role that China's own behavior plays in driving tensions or not, and how to respond. It seems like our base case given the people that she's surrounded himself with, is that he's probably receiving some advice that's, pretty sycophantic and probably more or less being told what he wants to hear. But I think another model is theoretically possible for a group of figures whose overarching political agenda is the same, basically to support the Xi Jinping project. Is it possible there's more room for them to debate the best way to carry out that agenda internally, given that they're kind of all in the same boat politically? And do we have kind of good evidence either way? Jude, maybe I'd go back to you on that, but I'd be curious what Rory and Amanda think as well.
Only, Jake, because you and I talked about this literally yesterday as we recorded a podcast about your report. My first contention is I think every organizational structure is on a continuum of dictatorship in terms of information that gets to the leader. I've worked in the private sector my entire life. I think every single entity is a version of this, where leaders of organizations have to work hard to get accurate information because the incentives are to basically affirm what you think your boss wants to hear. Jim Cook, who's the CEO of the Boston Brewing Company, has a famous sort of you can call BS rule, which is he worked hard to enforce a culture where any employee who's brewing Sam Adams beer can knock on his door and say, I think we're going in the wrong direction, but you had to offer an alternative fix. But I say that as the exception that proves the rule, which is you have to work very hard to create an organizational culture that avoids sycophancy, or just a polite version is sort of speaking to what you think the boss wants to hear. I think we know and can imagine that if that exists in the Boston, beer company, that's going to exist by magnitudes of order greater in China's political system. And so I think, Jake, your sort of dual framing, I think both are probably true at the same time. I think Xi Jinping did not build a team starting with the 19th Party Congress and then the 20th Party Congress that said, I want loyalists. I think what he said is, we've got a clear agenda. We know what we need to do. I need everybody on the boat who's going to row in the same direction, right? I don't need bickering and infighting. And I've been able to reach escape velocity in ways that Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin didn't, where I don't have these party elders breathing down my neck, constricting my bound of action. So I want a team that moves in the same direction. So I think that's what he thinks he's doing. The problem is, I'm sure that we have, because these are people who have in many ways owe their career to Xi Jinping, people like Cai Qi, who have no business being that high in the party hierarchy if it was based on the normal meritocratic sort of escalator. I'm sure understand that they serve at the pleasure of Xi Jinping. And so therefore, marshaling information that that carefully aligns with what you think Xi Jinping wants is probably the norm in the system. And so is he hearing heterodox views? Maybe one of the values of having someone like Li Qiang, who's very close to him, or a Cai Qi or Ding Xuexiang, is that they have the trust to be able to sneak in bits of inconvenient information because, they have a close relationship. But I suspect it's probably more of the former, which is we have a very sort of maladapted information ecosystem that's not giving Xi Jinping sort of a full range of opinions on issues.
That's great. Rory, Amanda, either of you want to come in on this question?
Sure. I think, we don't have really good evidence of how information flows in the Chinese system right now. We can only infer from what we know our Chinese interlocutors tell us and what we can see, which is to say, again, that the political environment is very tight, and there probably is some version of a game of telephone happening as information flows up and down the system. I think, though, one aspect of this information environment that I think deserves a little bit more attention and maybe a bit of a strategic rethink is the value of Xi Jinping thought in the system. So you're Xi Jinping, you're at the head of this massive bureaucracy governing a very dynamic and complex society, and you trust almost no one in the system, but you've got to somehow signal what your priorities are and what is acceptable within the bounds of a much tighter political system where you want to retain the power to, cut off the heads of someone who sticks their neck out too much. And that, I think, is where the Xi Jinping thought comes in. It gives lower level cadres and people who are existing in concert with the system, but slightly outside it, whether you're in the private sector or business, a top level understanding of what these changed political parameters are. So I think there's been, some kind of criticism in the Western media and analysis, criticism among private sector companies that are operating in China about the amount of time it takes to study and absorb Xi Jinping thought. But to me, that is actually the key to getting your information through to top leadership is couching it in the terms that the top leadership wants to hear the most about. So I think it has an incredible value in the political system. It should not be dismissed as an ideological exercise that is unworthy of people's time and attention. It tells us what to do. It gives the roadmap for bringing those actionable insights up through the system, and therefore, an area that I think American analysts and global analysts should give a little bit more time and attention to, even as it's complex, contradictory, confusing, sometimes maddening to work yourself through all of the tenets of it.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Amanda, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just to say that was a really great point, Rory, in terms of really learning from the Chinese as to how you package some of the messages you're trying to get through to the leadership. Listen, I don't think any of us really know what's going on at the top, right? But there are certain things we do know. So one, in terms of the information environment, there's plenty of anecdotes out there about the level of self-censorship that occurs throughout the system, including amongst Chinese scholars who sit inside government institutions, right? The objective is not to speak the truth necessarily, but to mirror what the top wants to hear. And this is out of consideration of both individual, but also bureaucratic and institutional interests, right? You want to make sure that your institution, is standing on the right side, really. But, I think there has been, following the 20th Party Congress and the end of COVID-19, I think greater dexterity and I might add rationality in the PRC's approach in its foreign policy, but that may be more reflective of Xi's more empowered position following the party Congress, rather than the composition or the kinds of conversations that are happening in the standing committee. I think for sure the amount of bargaining space is much more limited now, but I think that even if the committee is entirely composed, and it is composed of Xi loyalists, there will always inevitably be some degree of competition and clash of interests. And it's not just about jostling for power. I think some of it is simply because each of the men are tasked to represent different policy interests, and with it, the sort of institutional interests that come behind those sorts of policies, right? So whether it's Li Cheng in terms of economic growth or Tai Chi on the security side, right? There's a natural sort of clash in terms of, what those dual policies are trying to achieve at some point, right? And so I think given that, we know that there's at least some level of, division and clash of interests, even if it is within much smaller, I think, parameters under Xi.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, especially thinking about how, in a way, the bureaucracies and the people tasked with representing those bureaucracies in the elite leadership are therefore shaped in some ways by the bureaucracies, and presumably, that's maybe to Jude's example, that's something we see in the Chinese system, but also in every other system where senior leaders can kind of get captured in some ways or to some degree by the organizations they oversee. I think this also relates to another question about what has been the effect of China's domestic economic slowdown on Beijing's approach to the world. I mean, I think that this has been a pretty important, we can debate how structural this shift is, but if the old narrative was primarily about China's rapid rise and the kind of unstoppability of it, it's really put that's kind of shifted. Do we have any sense of how Xi seems to see these developments, and does he see them as challenges or as temporary? Does he see the challenges as temporary hurdles or more part of a structural slowdown? And what does that mean about what the rest of the foreign policy needs to do to support the economic situation or deal with the economic situation? So I'll just take this question. I see also some questions coming in the chat, so we'll go to the audience in just a second. But does anyone want to take on this question of how we're starting to see reflections of China's domestic economic slowdown in Beijing's foreign policy?
I can hazard a guess.
Great.
So first, I think the narrative on how the Chinese, especially the leadership, see the economic slowdown is more of a kaleidoscope than one clear narrative. Because I think on the one hand, you see Xi Jinping in speeches and high-level documents accepting part of the slowdown is inevitable. And I think a little bit like for folks old enough to have learned to drive stick shift, when you're shifting gears, the car will temporarily slow down before you can get a higher gear. And I think some amount of this is Xi Jinping saying, look, we've been operating off of an economic development agenda for a long time, which was building up systematic risks in the system. And so I am using my political capital to basically force painful changes. And so, a big puzzle initially sort of coming out of COVID is why, and even in COVID, is why isn't China stimulating more? And I think Xi Jinping was saying, first of all, I want to break the back of moral hazard for local governments. I know they're eating bitterness, but I don't care. You know, these folks have become too comfortable with a backstop from Beijing, and so we're going to have to push through painful reforms. Second, you know, I'm okay if Alibabas of the world get their stock price hit, because I don't want us steering, you know, shortages of talent, technology, and capital to effete bourgeois food delivery, you know, apps. I want this to be moving towards technologies which are going to power our economy in the future. And then finally is, you know, how do I, Xi Jinping, get out of some of these sort of productivity and demographic traps with the magic sprinkle of technology, right? If I have fewer workers, we need to build a robotics industry and an AI industry and a digital industry that basically allows us to give what workers we do have far more productivity capacity. So that's the sort of optimistic spin of it. The pessimistic spin is how much policy dysfunction, Jake, to a point you made in the report, just how much policy dysfunction there is across the system. And so I'm sure in Xi Jinping's head, the growth slowdown is a result of, you know, external containment plus the fact that we're shifting gears. And I think there's probably not as much introspection within the senior leadership about the way in which policy, you know, and political mishandling is contributing to this. And if you talk to sort of Chinese economists, even in the government, you know, on the econ side, they're far more aware of where policy mishaps are aggravating the growth slowdown. Final quick comment, because I realized your question was about foreign policy, which I just remembered. I think there's a broad logic to the fact that right now, to Amanda's point about some rationality in the system, right now at the margin, Beijing prefers a quiet external environment in areas where it feels like it has some control. I would say Second Thomas Shoal might be an outlier there potentially, in terms of, I think they would be willing to see increased friction if an opportunity arises. But in areas like how they've been handling cross-strait relations thus far since the January election, even in the bilateral relationship with the United States, you know, I think it's clear that, again, at the margin, not fundamentally, but at the margin, they prefer some stability. I think the question is, I don't think that's permanent. And I don't think that's permanent on the upside or the downside. If the economy improves, oftentimes you see more truculence from the Chinese when they feel confident. But I also think if the growth slowdown is the new normal, we shouldn't expect that Xi Jinping is going to play it cautious for the next decade. Over.
Yeah, I think that's right. Amanda, Rory, do you want to come in on this?
Sure. Just to say really quickly, I do think that we're seeing a sort of tactical moderation taking place. That has been in place, or the CCP has tried to put it in place since the 20th Party Congress. Obviously, we had a big balloon incident derail that, so that accounts for some of the delays, I'd say, on the U.S.-China front. And this is evident in, you know, whether it's, as Jude is saying, in cross-strait relations since the elections to statements that have come out of the Foreign Affairs Board Conference, right? There's sort of indications of this. But I would maybe just say that I think slowing domestic growth is a factor, right? And I don't know that it's clear to me how heavily that factor is weighed in this choice to be more tactically restrained, right? Other factors include the fact that US-China competition has intensified, the Biden administration has been quite effective at pulling in allies and partners, you know, including around denying China cutting edge technology. So I'm not sure about, you know, I think there's a number of factors that's causing this sort of tactical shift. And I think, you know, going forward, you know, what we probably want to ask ourselves is sort of, you know, will the leadership succeed? You know, as, you know, Jude was saying, I think according to those who watch the Chinese economy, Beijing has really chosen relatively modest efforts to stimulate the economy, which suggests some degree of confidence, right, that China can weather the storm. And so the question is whether the leadership will succeed. And will China be able to achieve sufficient technological breakthroughs? And I think another question maybe to ask is, if we assume lower levels of growth or different sources of growth that creates new winners and losers, you know, what's the new social contract, if anything, that emerges? And then how does that affect foreign policy? I think it's maybe a little bit early for answers to those questions, but I think Certainly, like a China that is distracted with internal challenges is less likely to create new problems abroad, but at the same time is more sensitive, perhaps, to, adversaries seen as taking advantage of their weaknesses.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Rory, do you want to come in on this one?
Maybe just very briefly. I think that it can sometimes be really confusing to look at Chinese foreign policy decision-making over time because it operates on a fair amount of inertia. I still think that the Chinese Communist Party's major focus is domestic and internal, and those priorities probably trump every other consideration, including how it executes foreign policy, unless it's directly linked back to those domestic political economy inputs. For example, Belt and Road projects that create the necessary inputs for manufacturing in China to then sell to the developed Western world and accrue, finance and economic benefit back to China. It seems to me that China, that the leadership style and the foreign policy decision-making style is to kind of wait for the crises to develop out of that foreign policy inertia and then make big decisions. I think there's clearly been a big decision in the last 2 years to try to improve the relationship with the US. And that probably came out of many different moments of crises. But it seems to me that crises and events tend to drive major shifts in foreign policy. And so it's really difficult to predict, what are the domestic political economy trends that have an effect on foreign policy. It's a little momentary to that moment of crisis. I think at a moment of crisis, Xi Jinping and top leaders sit down and say, hey, what's going on? How do we kind of shape it? Then they come out with big sweeping directional changes that are then implemented by the foreign policy and policymaking bureaucracy. So I would suggest maybe taking an analytical shift in approach from linking those two things together as like a continuous line and more as a series of moments and events that shape the policy over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's an important counterpoint to, the sort of canard that you often hear out here that everything in China is kind of long planned in the future. And they're always, that there is a lot more reactivity in the system than is probably frequently acknowledged. I want to turn to questions from the audience. So maybe I'll start with one from kind of combined one from Sasha. And she asks, Amanda, you mentioned the PRC has had a more rational foreign policy since the 20th Party Congress. How much does China's US watching community or Western watching community influence that? Are there many watchers of the West in the system, and how influential are they?
So the answer to that is yes, there are many America watchers across China's systems. The second question is much harder to answer. Based on anecdotes, it does seem that my sense, at least in terms of a shift that I've seen in the last, let's say, 8 years, that folks who are doing the sort of equivalent analytical work that we are doing in the think tanks that service the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or other state council agencies, but probably not the Ministry of State Security. So there's differences across the board. I think institutionally, my sense is that those servicing the MFA are often engaged in a fair amount of self-censorship. I think that even if an individual scholar seeks to try to, let's say, improve his country's policies, censorship occurs at the leadership levels of institutions. Okay, so there's so many layers of censorship here that we're talking about that one feels that how could it be possible that these guys have the same level of influence as they did in years past? Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case for those who sit under the Ministry of State Security. necessarily. But I think, though, compared to 7 or 8 years ago, influence at the scholarly or simply below leadership level is less. There's less influence all around. And as Rory was saying in the beginning, I think we just are struggling with the ability to influence those perceptions, knowing this constricted information environment exists.
Yeah, very insightful. Rory or Jude, do you all want to come in on this question? And then we'll have one more from the audience before we wrap up. No? Okay. Oh, go ahead if you like, Rory. Okay, all right. Sorry, I wasn't sure if you were coming in. All right, so we'll take the next question from Jeremy. And he says, can you talk about decision-making as it relates to PLA unsafe and risky intercepts against U.S. allies and partners? How should we think about the guidance released by Xi Jinping and the Central Military Commission, the CMC, as well as the question of crisis management or lack thereof involving the U.S. and PRC more recently? So maybe I'll just venture a quick my view on this, and then maybe others can jump in. So my view on this is that broadly speaking, the guidance from the top has probably been for the PLA to be more operationally aggressive at the tactical level. That broadly there's been guidance to broad guidance to say be more forward-leaning in defending our interests down to the tactical level. Now, how that's actually interpreted by any given operator, any pilot, any ship captain, any water cannon operator, and so on, might be beyond what the elite leadership really had in mind, or they just don't really understand at the tactical level what's available. But also in the field, tempers flare, right? I mean, people, it's not always an objective analysis that you might have back in Beijing or in Washington. It's probably different when you're seeing aircraft come at you quite quickly, or you feel like that's the day you want to be a hotshot in the pilot's seat. And so I think my sense is that that in the broad sense it's been deemed acceptable, but especially if it begets a crisis like the EP3 incident, the leadership will probably conclude that it maybe wasn't such a good idea, even though they sort of signed off on the broad direction. What do others think?
I mean, I think I would agree with everything you said, and just also add that I think in the U.S. strategic and policy community, we're very worried about unintended escalation of one of those incidents. And it occupies a lot of our strategic thinking and time. How do we put guardrails onto the relationship so that we can manage escalation? I don't think China sees this in the same way at all. I think they see the establishment of guardrails as kind of a seatbelt for the Americans or Western powers or allies to do more to challenge them. So I think you're right that tactically at an operational level, there's been a bit of a loosening of restraints to defend Chinese interests. That is how they would see it, not to be aggressive towards others, but to aggressively defend their interests. But I am, just like you, I think, less convinced that the Chinese political system would allow unintended escalation. And I think they see our attention to escalatory dynamics, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but around the world, as a constraint on any of those tactical changes or tactical missteps escalating into a wider war. So I think they feel kind of safe in some ways, just because of the U.S. strategic community's attention on de-escalation. And I think they also, but they would also politically constrain any crisis that would evolve. And you don't have to look too far into the recent past to see an example of this. When the Taiwan Coast Guard accidentally hit a PRC national boat and killed 2 PRC nationals, captured 2 others, there was not an immediate escalation of crisis. The political directives, I think, overwon the day, and there was a pulling back, and even in a very sensitive area with very sensitive incidents happening. So I think that is probably the pattern of behavior that we'll see in the current era until the guidance changes.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anyone else want to jump in on this last point, and then we'll wrap it up? No?
Just to say really quickly, I agree with all that, but I guess maybe a way of turning it around, as Rory was saying, the Chinese mindset on this is just fundamentally really different from the US's. In the Chinese conception of crisis management, it doesn't exclude escalation or risky maneuvers. In the sort of Chinese conception of crisis management, sometimes escalation or a greater show of military strength is needed to control and stabilize a burgeoning crisis, right? And so we've seen sort of writings on that, and we see it in the ways in which China is utilizing heightened risk, whether that's Taiwan or Second Thomas Shoal, to signal costs to an adversary or to a target government.
Yeah, I think that's right. And even when crises are de-escalated over time, there's often kind of a structural incremental price that's paid, as you said. Even I think in the Kinmen incident of recent, that's happened over this year, you've seen a more aggressive operational pattern in the vicinity of the archipelago. Even though the immediate crisis was de-escalated and was probably from the guidance to wait at least until May, until we see the incoming Lai administration, and then probably test them there in Taiwan. So we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much to Amanda, Rory, and Jude for joining the event and sharing just incredible insights with us. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today and for sharing your questions. Once again, the report is Beyond China's Black Box: 5 Trends Shaping Beijing's Foreign and Security Policy Decision-Making under Xi Jinping, and it's available for download now at cnas.org. We will see you next time. Goodbye.